Hi, nice to meet you. Nice to see you. Yes.
I want to start off with some political questions.
Yep.
How would you describe the current political landscape in Moldova and Georgia? And what are the main factors influencing public opinion?
Mm-hmm. Well, I would say that for both countries, we are talking about a situation which is, for not using a technical terminology, messy, and the situation which is potentially unstable. The main factor behind this is that in both countries, also, let's say, in different ways, society seems divided. I would say that this is not a matter of political ideology, it's not a matter of left and right, as we are maybe used, in our context, but it's also a matter that overlaps quite a lot with, let's say, the country's geopolitical direction, the country's, let's say, relations with others. So both in the case of Georgia and in the case of Moldova, the direction of the country, let's say, whether it moves closer to the EU and potentially one day becomes a new member, or let's say if it develops better relationship with Russia, or in a case like becomes basically a vassal of Russia, this is basically what is at stake. Of course, along with that comes also a set of different packages. Obviously, let's say for the part of the society that supports a more pro-European trend, a more pro-European development, there is also an understanding that this implies a more liberal development in terms of country, which basically means that, support more for individual rights, even to some extent for minorities. Also, I'm talking about gender, sexual minorities and so on. On the other hand, there is more emphasis on traditional values and so on. But I would say that really the big curse that we have seen in both cases, and that's why as of now in both countries, the political situation is less than stable, is that basically the society is divided between these two perspectives. And if you look at the case of Georgia, obviously fraud has played quite a big role, regardless of how much of that is admitted by the government or by even international observers. But overall, there is a consistent part of Georgians that think that they are better off with a government which is increasingly autocratic and with, let's say, being at peace with Russia, whatever it means. In the case of Moldova, same story. There is a part of the population that believes that Moldova is better off, let's say, in good terms with Russia and potentially getting closer to Russia. And there is another part of the society which believes that the future is Europe. And the problem is that there is very little ground for these two sides to meet in the middle, because basically these choices are very much zero-sum game. It's quite difficult to say, I pick a bit of this and a bit of that.
How does the Moldovan public perceive the possibility of joining the European Union?
I think that there are two sides of this. Let's say, as I said, the society in Moldova is quite divided. So for the ones who support the process of European integration, I would say that there are at least two sets of reasons. One is, let's say, more pragmatic, and I would say this is probably the most widespread, which basically equates European integration with economic development, with success, with, let's say, a working economy, with, let's say, opportunities to travel and, to kind of find success maybe in other member states. And then there is also more identity and to some extent normative component of it. Europe means freedom. Europe means democracy. Europe means that somehow your individual rights are protected. I have to say that maybe this part, this ideal part, is more common among young people and maybe among really very strong, ideologically committed supporters of European integration. I would say the largest part of support relates to the idea that, well, Moldova is better off economically, Moldova is more secure. If you look at the other part of the story, the ones that are against, even for them European integration matters, but basically on the negative side. And even here I would say that the two reasons for being against are the same story, economic and identitarian. Economic, because let's be frank, nowadays Moldova is suffering quite a lot out of the geopolitical situation. The fact that Moldova is, let's say, in critical relations, so bad relations with Russia, has costed Moldova a lot. The question is whether, let's say, it makes sense to give away your independence to have good relations with Russia, but that's another question. So basically, economically, it costed dearly to Moldova, and the situation for many people is actually quite dire. And the other one has also to do, once again, with more perception, ideas, values. And there is a part of the Moldovan society which is on the fairly conservative side, between fairly and very conservative. And to them, EU means, let's say, throwing away traditional values, renouncing or denouncing orthodoxy, and so on and so forth. So let's say, I would say for both sides, either it's interest-oriented or it's identity-oriented. And I would say this counts pretty much the same on both sides.
But what actions is Moldova currently taking to progress towards EU membership? And what are the main challenges it faces along the way?
I mean, what the last elections confirmed, although in a very thin way, is that Moldovan elites, the ones in government, are committed to, again, proceed on the path of European integration. And a thin majority of the population, because let's be frank, we're talking about a thin majority, supports proceeding along this path. Maybe a comment on this. I make the thin majority out of the referendum that passed about including in the constitution the commitment to European integration. It's important to stress that not all the ones that opposed that referendum automatically were against European integration. The idea, some opposition parties said that maybe there was no need to put that into the constitution. So I would say maybe it's a bit bigger part of the population that supports European integration, but still, as I said, the population is divided. What can Moldova do? Well, first of all, I would say commit to factual and actual reforms, and not only, again, reforms to be done on paper. This, I would say, is something that does not affect only Moldova. It's something that we've seen in the Western Balkans. It's something that we have seen in other countries in Eastern Europe. So again, it's easier to approve a law than to implement it. And this is one of the risks that, of course, Moldova will be running through over the next months and year. I would say Moldova has one advantage vis-a-vis, for example, Ukraine, which is doesn't have openly hostile member states inside the EU. In the case of Ukraine, it's, for example, Hungary or maybe to some extent Slovakia. Moldova doesn't have these cases. Moldova has also a couple of other advantages. At the moment, Moldova is not in any hot conflict with Russia, and Moldova is small. And this is an advantage because for the EU to take over countries that are small, it's a bit less of a, of an effort, and it's not such a big slice of cake. The minus is, as I said, that you need to bring on board also the population. And very often when you do reforms, someone is going to pay a price for these reforms. So there is an economic cost attached. For example, I'm thinking that, one of the big chapters of negotiation has to do, for example, with agriculture, let's say. Some might sound as a boring topic, but the point is that to many, that's a source of income and feeding. So the point is that the moment in which Moldovan agriculture will have to be made compatible with EU standards, if you are a large company, you can do it. If you are a small producer, it's a huge economic effort, and you might be basically simply kicked out of the market. So in a way, there is going to be someone who pays the price, and that is definitely one factor that might make parts of the population skeptic. The other thing is, of course, that when it comes to European integration, you do the efforts today, and you will see the fruits in a few 5, 6, 7 years. So the point is that from now to then, you will have to keep the population engaged. Maybe the last minus that Moldova has to deal with is that the country is not only divided, the country is what I would say hyper-regionalized. So we all are aware of Transnistria, again, the de facto state or seceding region, and that's one problem per se. But inside Moldova, you also have, for example, Gagauzia, which is like an autonomous republic inside Moldova. It's literally like, a stripe of land. The problem is that it's, I would say, even more pro-Russian, even more controlled, or let's say absorbing the narratives of Moscow even more than Transnistria. And if you look, for example, at the results of the referendum, more than 90% there opposed including this European clause in the constitution, and almost no one voted for Maia Sandu in the last election. So these are really issues to deal with, and for a country of this size, having micro, or let's say having smaller regions inside, which are either semi-autonomous or have even aspirations to more autonomy and potentially one day independence, is definitely a problem, is definitely something that undermines the effort, and Russia is playing with that.
But how has the war in Ukraine impacted Moldova's and Georgia's domestic policies and foreign relations?
Mm-hmm. It has made the situation more complicated in both countries. I would say when we look at the direction that the two countries' governments have taken, they're basically spectacularly different. In the case of Moldova, the government of Maia Sandu has been very supportive of Ukraine. In the case of Georgia, the government of Georgian Dream has been saying that's Ukraine's war, we are not part of the war, and we don't want to be part of the war. So to some extent they've taken a much more detached position, which it's to some extent almost in line with what Russia desires. But I would say in both cases it has further polarized the societies. The society has been divided between those that by supporting Ukraine even more want to pursue a pro-European path and get the way of Russia with Russia, and the other side that says, no, we don't want to end up like Ukraine, so we need to stay close to Russia. And so in a way, it has further polarized the political debate, and in a way, it has also further polarized the partisan clash between, let's say, maybe opposition parties. In Moldova, for example, they are the ones that tend to be more on the pro-Russian side, and the government. In Georgia is the opposite, basically. But at the same time, I would say that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has also given these two countries, along with Ukraine, the possibility for the first time to aspire to become EU members. Let's be very frank, before 2022, chances that Moldova, Ukraine and Georgia would have become EU member states were very, very far away in the future. So was not something that was seriously discussed in Brussels. After Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I would say now we are talking about something which maybe in not such a close future, but it is a possibility. So in a way, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the fact that Ukraine is resisting and the fact that Ukraine has become a new candidate has also unlocked this possibility for Moldova and Georgia, which is something that was before almost unthinkable. So I would say it has been definitely a moment of stress, but it has also been a moment in which certain things have become possible.
But how effective have Western sanctions against Russia been in altering the geopolitical dynamics in Moldova and Georgia?
Sanctions, I think that, again, in the case of Georgia, the sanctions towards Russia, given the current situation, have been an economic blessing, in a sense that since Georgia is not aligned with the EU sanctions, and Georgia has proven to be a safe harbor both for Russians who just want to maybe stay not too far from home, but maybe not necessarily at home. And in general, again, the borders are open. And by the way, just to say, there have been discussions which by now have concretized to kind of, reopen direct flights between Russia and Georgia. So basically, the fact that Georgia is not aligned to sanctions regime has been an opportunity for Georgia. So economy has to some extent profited out of that. For Moldova, it's a bit different because Moldova has tried to comply with the EU requirements. There have been some shortcomings, but overall, let's say, Moldova has been in line with the EU, with what the EU is doing. Of course, point is that a big difference between Georgia and Moldova is that Moldova doesn't have an open border with Russia, doesn't have a border with Russia. There is Transnistria, which at the same time, with all the minuses, enjoys a relatively open relationship with its home country, with Moldova. So I would say that the big problem for Moldova has been that while there wasn't too much already in maybe the last 4 or 5 years open trade with Russia, Moldova had already a very poor and, let's say, underperforming economy. So adding to that the impact of the sanctions, also, for example, if you think not necessarily of sanction, but certain sector, energy, for example, Russia has been weaponizing that. So all this put together has made the economic situation even worse. And I would say that, of course, this is something that many Moldovans basically feel on their own pocket.
And how is Georgia balancing its aspirations for closer ties with the West while managing the pressures and Russia's influence?
Not well. I think that the problem is that regardless of what Georgian elites and the government of Georgian Dream is telling us, things are going a bit in the wrong direction. So, of course, what they keep telling us is that Georgia is as committed as ever to European integration, at the same time doesn't want a war with Russia. I'm putting it this way, while the second part is relatively visible, there is very little visibility on Georgia's commitment on European integration because regardless of what the elites say outside, it's very visible what the elites do at home and also what the elites say at home. The EU has already informed Georgia that as of now, any new step in terms of membership or new negotiations have been frozen, which basically means that as of now, we can consider the case of Georgia for, let's say, negotiation and so on, frozen because of the political situation. It's interesting because formally the EU did not connect it to the results of the elections or to the alleged rigging nature of the elections, but it has basically connected to the erosion of rule of law and of, let's say, fair play in politics over the last year. But it's obvious that, let's say, there is a connection with the result of the election, the way in which the elections were run. Now, I think that Georgia is still a boiling pot in a sense that although maybe what we expected was, okay, there have been the elections, now people go to protest in front of the parliament. This happened basically the day after or 2 days after, and then we didn't hear much. Now, we already seen that, today, yesterday, there have been much more kind of, boiling into the pot, and I think that this will continue possibly for the next months. I think that the EU, to some extent, has in its hand a tool which is both powerful but also dangerous. Because the moment in which the EU says, guys, if things continue like this, not even if things continue like this, as things stand, consider Georgia's integration into the EU over by now, the EU knows one thing, that many people in Georgia are very willing to join the European Union and are very strongly supporting that. So, on the one hand, this is a very good opportunity to channel mobilization of the pro-European part of Georgia. Problem is that this might also trigger a lot of violence in the country if, of course, let's say, things escalate, and on the other hand, once you open the Pandora box, then it's very difficult to close it. So in a way, we don't know if, let's say, the situation escalates. Georgian Dream has already proven that they have no problem in kind of using violence to repress. The question is, how do the peaceful protesters react? Will they be always peaceful, or at a certain point, let's say, it will become a bit more confrontational? And also the point is that to what extent police or maybe even armed forces will remain loyal to the government. So again, it's of course an opportunity for the Georgian people to have its voice heard, but could also be, on the other hand, something that turns violent. I think at the moment we are kind of, seeing the pot boiling. We don't know exactly yet what it cooks inside.
How significant is the threat of Russian military action or influence in Moldova and Georgia, especially in regions with frozen conflicts?
I think in the case of Georgia, as I said, provided the government manages to keep playing this game in which Russia is, let's say, increasingly appeased and potentially, let's say, relations normalize, I think that simply Russia will maintain its presence in Abkhazia and South Ossetia, but I don't think that Russia would have any interest at this point, if the government of Georgian Dream maintains the current trend, to challenge further Georgian sovereignty. Let's say Georgian sovereignty already threatened enough. There is no need to do it further. Moldova is different. I think that Moldova is increasingly a target for Russia. And maybe here there are two things. One is that what Russia can do. Now, Moldova has one advantage. Doesn't have an open border with Russia, doesn't have a border with Russia. So anything that Russia should do through proxies in Moldova. It means that either, let's say, some forces or some kind of powers inside the country play the game of Russia, and either with soft coups or maybe winning elections and so on and so forth, they manage to change the turn of the country. Again, soft coup simply would mean that in a way like certain political forces mobilize people, maybe force the president or the prime minister out of power. That's what it means. Russia is also another tool, which is Transnistria. As of now, Transnistria is very isolated. Russia basically barely manages to keep control of it, so Transnistria will not become a vector of Russia's, let's say, direct threat. Of course, I think that the biggest, most direct challenge for Moldova would be if something big geopolitically changes in the map, if you look at Ukraine. Because the point is that we know that should something big happen there, say Odessa fall, for example, well, between Odessa and Moldova, there is almost nothing. So obviously, let's say, should Russia have like big military success in Ukraine, or again, should Ukraine capitulate, or worst case scenarios, I would say that the threat becomes much more direct to Moldova. But for sure, yeah, Russia is trying to play not only hybrid games, but also kind of soft and less soft strategies to undermine the Moldovan government.
But how are they collaborating with their neighboring countries to address regional security and economic issues?
Well, I would say that when it comes again to Moldova overall is quite, as I said, aligned with the EU approach. Primarily, Moldova has, again, very much shares the EU way of doing things when it comes again to respond to the geopolitical challenges. Coordination with Brussels is quite good. Moldova has also another advantage. It has a very good friend and a country with which it shares quite a lot of cultural and political ties. That's Romania. Romania, in the past, despite these ties, has been relatively restrained. Now there are more discussion about Romania playing a more active role in the security of Moldova. So if that would become more concrete, of course, this would strengthen the sovereignty of Moldova. When it comes to Georgia, I would say that overall, the potential of cooperation of Georgia with other countries of the region, talking about South Caucasus, is undermined by the fact that the other two countries in South Caucasus, well, used to have some minor issues in the past. Armenia and Azerbaijan have been for quite some time almost in a state of war. Now, of course, we don't know exactly what's going to happen there. Probably there might be a bit more relaxed development over the years. And the good thing is that Georgia, regardless of being governed by Georgian Dream or someone else, has been always like, a point of contact between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and this probably will remain. Georgia has also been developing good ties with Turkey over the past years. And I would say that if you look at which actors Georgia, and especially Georgian Dream's Georgia, has been like prioritizing over the last maybe 4 or 5 years, you will see that, you won't find too many democracies. You find Turkey, you find Serbia, you find China, and so in a way, probably the fact that Georgian Dream is moving in the direction of a more autocratic understanding of power also reflects on their friends.
But what is the current status of peace progress in Transnistria, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia?
I would say that here things might vary quite a bit. Obviously, the first question is like, how do we define conflict? I think that if we look at these three contexts, probably Transnistria is the more relaxed of these three conflicts. I mean, the dividing line, I mean, you shouldn't call it border because Transnistria is not a state, but basically the dividing line or the informal border is relatively open. You go to Chisinau, you see very easily Transnistrian car plates and vice versa. I would say that to some extent the war has given maybe to Moldova a bit more of stake and leverage because Transnistria is more isolated. Russia cannot anymore kind of supply it via air. So in a way you will see that Transnistria is suffering quite a lot out of, let's say, this lack of contact with Russia, and in a way this pushes Transnistria further to at least being a bit more dialogic with Moldova. When it comes to South Ossetia and Abkhazia, I would say that even here I would differentiate. Because let's be frank, South Ossetia is literally a stripe of land, was only relevance is militarily presence of Russia. Population is very small, and I would say it's very hard to call it even a de facto state. Basically, it's a land in which Russia basically maintains a military presence. And there I would say very little ground for any development. When it comes to Abkhazia, we have seen that over the last weeks and months, there has been some trouble for Russia. I think that this is due to two things. Economic situation a bit kind of, declining, let's say getting worse. And on the other hand, political control by Moscow being a bit more challenged. The elites are perceived as too pro-Russia and too corrupt. And so, of course, in a way, this might give more leverage to internal opposition in Abkhazia. At the same time, I would see very little ground for, let's say, either reintegration of Abkhazia inside Georgia or, let's say, moving away from the status quo. Because while maybe more and more Abkhaz feel also threatened by Moscow, they definitely don't want to go back to Georgia. So I think that this would still keep the situation frozen as it is now.
What are the main economic challenges facing Moldova and Georgia in 2024?
When it comes to Moldova, I already mentioned, I think that the main challenge has been the declining standard of living, primarily connected to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Why? Because it cut markets and it made things more expensive, especially the one that come from Russia, again, energy decoupling and so on. So obviously, if energy duplicates in price, this has been something that is definitely felt in every sector of the economy and felt on people's pockets. So this is something that made, for example, the current government very unpopular among some sectors of the society and has been a big moment of stress for the population. In terms of, let's say, the pluses, I would say that to some extent the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement with the EU and the fact that Moldova has been enjoying almost open free access to the EU single market, plus now with the pre-accession tool, the funds that support transformation in the direction of European integration, maybe some alleviation will come, but still I would say that the last maybe 2-3 years have been very challenging for many Moldovans. When it comes to Georgia, while, let's say, the factors that relate directly to economy and Russia have not been so challenging, exactly because, as I said, Georgia didn't align to sanctions, relatively, let's say, is in the process of normalizing the situation with Russia. Maybe one factor that has been detrimental also for Georgia has been the very large influx of both Russians and Ukrainians. In the case of Moldova, that has been the case, for example, for Ukrainians. The fact that many new people come to your country has two major impacts. One, of course, is like simply the population challenge. People become more, they need more housing, they need more infrastructure and so on, and this increases the costs. And the other one, this is especially in the case of Georgia, if, let's say, rich Russians move there because they don't want to stay in Russia, they bring their money, and of course it also means that cost of living goes up because they can afford more and paying more for that. Same applies, for example, when it comes to apartments or when it comes to renting.
And what impact have European Union financial aid and investments had on Moldova's economic development and infrastructure projects?
Well, I would say that this has been quite visible. I mean, if you look at Chisinau today and look at Chisinau, I don't know, 10 years ago, you can definitely see the impact of EU support. I would say that obviously with the candidacy, more infrastructural support comes, so we might expect obviously more visible impact of that. The minus side of that is that EU money also means money, and it also means that that also not legitimate interest might be interested in that. Moldova still has a quite high level of corruption, and this of course might be let's say a path through which some of the EU money might be hijacked. So in a way, I think that the risk of not all the population enjoying in the same way the advantages and, let's say, the economic also prosperity that might come out of getting closer to European integration is a problem and is a challenge. At the same time, let's say, part of the EU negotiation and part basically of the EU accession process is also this idea that Moldova should fight corruption with more vigor. So we expect that to some extent this is something that should be taken care in the mid-short term.
And what strategies is Georgia employing to attract foreign investment, particularly in light of increasing regional instability?
Mm-hmm. Well, as I said, I think that Georgia is shooting pretty much in every direction. So pretty much everything is welcome in Georgia. EU and Russia are the two main actors that play there. But again, we have seen quite a lot of investments coming from Turkey, quite a lot of investment. Actually, this has been around for quite some time, from China and so on. So to some extent, I would say that the idea that Georgia has been propagating is that Georgia is a good country for business. The fact that Georgia is not actively supporting Ukraine, to some extent not supporting either side, has been sold by the Georgian government as a sort of, in a way, moment of stability in which they say, okay, yes, there is trouble all around us, but that's exactly why we want to stay kind of, away from any trouble. And so everyone is welcome in Georgia. And this, I think, has been like a narrative that Georgia has been using, and it works to some extent better with the global south, for example, than with EU countries or Western countries. Yeah.